For 640 years, one family ruled. Then, in about 6 weeks, they lost everything: the throne, the palaces, the army, the country itself. And yet 70 years later, a member of that same deposed family would stand at a border crossing and help tear a hole in the Iron Curtain. How does a dynasty, with no crown, no army, and no legal claim to anything, end up changing the course of the Cold War? That question is where this story actually begins. To understand it, you have to go back to a freezing morning in Vienna, November 1918. A 31-year-old man named Karl is sitting in a room at Schönbrunn Palace, and he's being asked to sign away an empire. He's not a lifelong ruler. He was never supposed to be emperor at all. He was a grandnephew, a minor branch of the family, until the assassination of his Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914 suddenly made him heir. 2 years later, when the old Emperor Franz Joseph finally died after a 68-year reign, Karl inherited a throne in the middle of the First World War. He didn't start that war. He almost certainly couldn't have won it. And now, with the empire disintegrating underneath him, Czechoslovakia declaring independence, the South Slavs breaking away, Hungary pulling out, Poland reforming as a nation, his own government is telling him it's over. Here's the detail that makes this moment stranger than it first appears. Karl did not abdicate. He was offered the word, and he refused to use it. What he signed instead, on 11 November 1918, was a document renouncing every participation in the affairs of state. A legal sleight of hand he'd insisted on, because privately, he believed the throne was his by divine right and no parliament could take it from him. He later described the document, in a letter to the Archbishop of Vienna, as something closer to a note signed at gunpoint than a real abdication. That distinction, abdicate versus renounce, sounds like lawyers' language. But it's also the single decision that would define the rest of his life, and his family's fight for the next century. That evening, Karl and his wife Zita left Schönbrunn for the last time and drove to Eckartsau, an imperial hunting lodge in the marshy country east of Vienna. It was cold. Food was scarce. And there were real fears the family might meet the same fate as the Romanovs in Russia, who'd been murdered by the Bolsheviks only months earlier. The British government took the threat seriously enough to send an army officer, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Liesel Strutt, to personally safeguard the family. It's a small, easy-to-miss fact, but it matters, because without Strutt's protection, this story might have ended in that hunting lodge in the winter of 1918, not in the Atlantic Ocean 4 years later. Then came the part the new Austrian government actually wanted, to make sure the Habsburgs could never come back. On 3 April 1919, Parliament what's now simply called the Habsburg Law. It banished Karl from Austria for life. It said other family members could only return if they gave up their claims entirely and lived as private citizens. And it confiscated the property: Schönbrunn, the Hofburg, the imperial art collections, the great court library that's now Austria's national library. Everything the dynasty had accumulated over 6 centuries, transferred to the state, gone in a single piece of legislation. Try to picture what that actually means. Waking up to learn your family name is now legally radioactive, your home belongs to strangers, and you can never set foot in the country your ancestors ruled for longer than the United States has existed. Karl was already gone by the time the law passed. On 23 March 1919, with Strutt's help, he and his family boarded a train for Switzerland. But at the border, Karl did something almost defiant. He issued what's known as the Feldkirch Manifesto, formally revoking his earlier renunciation and declaring that he'd been unlawfully deposed. He was, in his own mind, still emperor. He simply wasn't allowed to act like one. Switzerland let the family stay, but on tight terms, first at a castle near Lake Constance, then, when the Swiss got nervous about having a deposed monarch that close to the Austrian border, further away at the Villa Prangens on Lake Geneva. And here's where the story quietly turns into one about money, because it's easy to imagine exile as merely humiliating. For the Habsburgs, it was also financially catastrophic. The peace settlement had floated the idea of an annual allowance for Karl from the successor states, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. It was never paid. Not once. The family survived by selling off jewels and artwork they'd managed to carry out of Austria in 8 railway wagons, piece by piece, funding a household that by the end included 8 children. And then Karl made a decision that would cost him everything that was left. In the spring of 1921, he decided the only way back was to simply go and take it. Hungary, unlike Austria, hadn't formally abolished its monarchy. It was being run by a regent, Admiral Miklos Horthy, technically holding the throne in trust. Karl believed that if he showed up in person, the country would rally behind him and Horthy would step aside. On Easter Sunday, 26 March 1921, using a forged passport, Karl traveled to Budapest and appeared at Horthy's residence, expecting a restoration. He got a refusal. Horthy told him the neighboring countries, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, a bloc known at the time as the Little Entente, would very likely invade Hungary the moment a Habsburg sat back on the throne. Whether Horthy genuinely believed that, or simply didn't want to hand back the power he already held, is something historians still argue about. Either way, Karl went home empty-handed. Most people would have stopped there. Karl tried again. In October 1921, he flew secretly into western Hungary with Zita, and this time a small force of loyal troops rallied to him. For a few days, an actual restoration looked possible. Then Horthy's forces met them outside Budapest. There was a brief clash, and Karl surrendered to avoid more bloodshed. He and Zita detained at Tihany Abbey on the shore of Lake Balaton. And that was the moment the Western powers decided they'd had enough of him. 2 attempted comebacks in a single year had convinced Britain and its allies that Karl, loose anywhere in Europe, was a standing invitation to instability. So in November 1921, Karl and his family were quietly loaded onto the British cruiser HMS Cardiff and taken out to sea. Not even the ship's crew knew where they were going at first. The destination, when the captain finally received his sealed orders, was Madeira, a Portuguese island more than 500 miles off the coast of Portugal, chosen precisely because it was remote enough that Karl could never again show up unannounced at anyone's palace. What happened on that island is where the tragedy stops being political and becomes something more human. The family arrived with almost nothing. The jewels and art that had funded 2 failed coups were gone. They started in an expensive hotel in Funchal they couldn't actually afford, then moved into a borrowed villa called Quinta do Monte, high in the cool, damp mountains above the town, beautiful and reportedly with fungus growing on the walls. In March 1922, weakened already by a bout of Spanish flu, Karl caught a chill in town that turned into bronchitis, then pneumonia. By some accounts, the family couldn't initially afford a doctor. On 1 April 1922, with Zita holding a crucifix in front of him, Karl died. He was 34 years old. According to accounts from those present, his final words were a prayer, "Thy will be done, as you, Jesus." A modest funeral followed 4 days later in the small church of Nossa Senhora do Monte in Funchal. The man who had, only 4 years earlier, ruled over more than 50 million people was buried on a subtropical island in the middle of the Atlantic. To this day, the Austrian government has never allowed his remains to be moved to the Habsburg crypt in Vienna, where every one of his ancestors for 3 centuries is buried. He remains permanently in exile, even in death. You'd think that's the end of the story. It gets interesting. At Karl's deathbed, Zita, 29 years old, 8 children, almost no money, and now a widow, turned to their eldest son and told him his father was now sleeping the eternal sleep, and that he, Otto, was emperor and king. Otto was 9 years old. Think about what that actually asks of a child. Zita raised him for the rest of his childhood as though a throne might genuinely be waiting for him, hiring Hungarian Benedictine monks and tutors from 3 countries, teaching him 6 languages, drilling him in the same discipline and Catholic devotion that had shaped Habsburg rulers for centuries. The family bounced between borrowed homes for years, eventually settling with help from Spanish aristocrats in the Basque town of Laquisio, where 40 grandee families pooled money to buy them a villa. Otto grew into a serious, academically formidable young man. He earned a doctorate in political and social sciences from the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, studying under a pseudonym. And then a much darker shadow fell over Europe, and it had Otto's family in its sights, specifically. Adolf Hitler had grown up an Austrian citizen, and he despised the Habsburgs with a very personal intensity. To him, their old empire, multi-ethnic and Catholic and cosmopolitan, was everything he wanted Europe to stop being. When it became clear Hitler intended to annex Austria, Otto actually offered to return from exile and take charge of the government himself, as an act of open defiance. Austria's Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg seriously considered it, and then turned it down, worried it would provoke Hitler even further. In March 1938, Germany invaded anyway. The Nazis reinstated the Habsburg law that had actually been repealed just 3 years earlier, in 1935. They seized what property remained, and they sentenced Otto to death in absentia. Rudolf Hess reportedly gave a standing order that Otto was to be executed on sight if caught. Otto's own cousins, Max and Ernst of Hohenberg, were arrested by the Gestapo and sent to Dachau, where they stayed for the rest of the war. Otto didn't run. From exile in Belgium, then Paris, he became a genuine figurehead of the Austrian resistance, helping an estimated 15,000 Austrians, including thousands of Austrian Jews, get out of the country. When France fell in 1940, Otto and his family escaped to Portugal on visas signed by a Portuguese consul in Bordeaux named Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who was defying his own government's direct orders by issuing them. From there, Otto reached the United States, settled for a time in Washington, D.C., met personally with President Roosevelt, and lobbied Congress to treat Austria as a victim of Nazi aggression rather than a willing partner. An argument that would remain politically controversial for decades. In 1941, Hitler personally stripped Otto, his mother, and his siblings of their citizenship. The family that had once ruled 50 million people was now, officially, stateless. When the war finally ended in 1945, you might expect the Habsburgs to have been welcomed home as anti-Nazi resistance figures. They weren't. Austria's post-war government, heavily socialist and still resentful of the old imperial order, kept the Habsburg law firmly on the books. The 1955 treaty that restored Austria's sovereignty and ended Allied occupation actually required Austria to keep the anti-Habsburg legislation in place, at Soviet insistence. Moscow had no interest whatsoever in a monarchist revival, sitting on its doorstep in Central Europe. So Otto was stuck in an almost absurd position. Head of one of Europe's oldest royal houses, and legally barred from the country, his family had ruled for over 600 years. This standoff dragged on for years and became known, quite seriously, as the Habsburg Crisis. In 1961, Otto made the calculation that ended it. He signed a formal declaration renouncing his membership in the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, and every claim derived from it, declaring himself a loyal citizen of the Republic. A move he later admitted, decades afterward, felt like being blackmailed, even though he stood by its legal validity. It still took years of court proceedings and political fighting before anything changed. It wasn't until 1966, after a conservative election victory, that Otto was finally issued an Austrian passport. On 31 October of that year, 48 years after his family had been driven out, Otto set foot on Austrian soil again for the first time, traveling quietly to Innsbruck to visit a family grave. Now here's the open question this whole story has been building toward. What does a deposed heir with no throne actually do with the rest of his life? Otto didn't spend it lobbying for a restoration. He spent it building something almost like the opposite of an empire, a voluntary one. He'd already been active for years in the Pan-European Union, a movement pushing for European integration since the 1920s. He became its vice president in 1957 and its president in 1973, a post he'd hold for over 30 years. In 1978, he took German citizenship, and the following year he was elected to the European Parliament representing Bavaria's Christian Social Union, where he'd served for 2 decades. becoming its longest-serving member. Inside that parliament, one of his first acts was to have an empty chair placed in the chamber, a quiet, symbolic reminder of the countries still trapped behind the Iron Curtain, unable to send anyone at all. That symbol turned out to be more than symbolic. On 19 August 1989, a small, almost informal event took place on the border between Austria and Hungary near the town of Sopron. It was called the Pan-European Picnic, organized by the Hungarian Democratic Forum and the Pan-European Movement, with Otto and reformist Hungarian minister Imre serving as the event's official patrons. Otto wasn't even physically present. His daughter read his message on stage. The plan, agreed with Hungary's reform-minded government, was modest. Open a border gate for a few hours as a gesture toward a united Europe. Word had already spread among East German tourists vacationing at Lake Balaton that the gate might open. When it did, more than 600 of them simply walked across it into Austria. The Hungarian border guards, technically still operating under shoot-to-kill orders, chose not to fire a single shot. Within weeks, Hungary formally opened its western border for good, and the trickle of East Germans heading west became something no regime could stop. On 9 November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. East Germany's deposed leader, Erich Honecker, is reported to have said afterward that this Habsburg had driven the nail into his coffin. It might be the strangest compliment in modern European history. The heir to a throne that no longer existed had helped bring down a wall that, 4 months earlier, had seemed permanent. Otto stayed in the European Parliament until 1999, then remained active in advisory roles until his death in Pocking, Bavaria, on 4 July 2011, at the age of 98. His funeral bridged 3 centuries. His body was carried to the Capuchin crypt, the same imperial burial vault that had received Habsburg emperors for over 300 years. And the traditional Habsburg burial ritual was performed at its doors. A grand chamberlain knocking 3 times and announcing Otto's full title, a friar from within asking who sought entry, and after the long list of titles was read out a second time, the friar replying that he did not know this person. Only when Otto was described simply as a mortal, sinful man, begging for the mercy of God, were the doors finally opened. Following another old Habsburg custom, his heart was removed and taken separately to the Benedictine Abbey of Pannonhalma in Hungary, his own request, a final gesture toward the country his family had once ruled, and that he'd helped set free from communism decades later. Otto stepped down as head of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine on 1 January 2007, and his son Karl took over. And Karl von Habsburg is, in a lot of ways, what this dynasty looks like once it's had a century to figure out what it's actually for. Born in Starnberg, Bavaria, in January 1961, he's the grandson of the last emperor, and like his father before him, he was legally barred from Austria for the first years of his life. He studied law and served briefly in the Austrian armed forces before being elected to the European Parliament himself, from 1996 to 1999. But his defining work has been elsewhere. From 2008 to 2020, he served as president of Blue Shield International, an organization devoted to protecting cultural heritage, museums, monuments, archives from war and disaster, something often described as a cultural equivalent of the Red Cross. In June 2026, Karl met with Czech President Petr Pavel at Prague Castle, reportedly the first time a Czech head of state had formally received a member of the former ruling House of Habsburg. In the aftermath, Pavel was quoted in Czech media suggesting he saw no problem, in principle, with the Czech Republic one day becoming a parliamentary monarchy again. Remarks that stirred plenty of debate, though nothing close to an actual proposal. What's clear is how differently each generation has answered the same inherited question. Otto didn't try to rebuild the empire, he helped build the European Union instead. Karl doesn't rule from a palace, he's spent his career protecting other people's cultural heritage from destruction. And his own son, Ferdinand, the current heir apparent to a headship with no throne attached to it, doesn't command armies. He races cars professionally in the FI World Endurance Championship and won the 24 Hours of Le Mans outright in the LMP2 class back in 2021. Most of the people he races against, by his own account, have no idea the Habsburg name means anything more than a burger chain. As for the family's actual wealth today, this is one part of the story that resists a clean answer. And it's worth being honest about that rather than inventing a number. The 1919 law stripped the Habsburgs of everything considered state property. The palaces, the crown jewels, the imperial art collections. What individual family members kept was private property, and how that's been managed since has never been made public in any verifiable way. Estimates you'll find online range enormously and mostly trace back to unsourced celebrity wealth websites, rather than anything a historian or journalist has actually confirmed, which is really just another way of saying nobody outside the family actually knows. And the family isn't telling. There's one more thread worth pulling before we close this out, because it says something about how far this story has traveled from where it started. In 2004, Pope John Paul II beatified Emperor Karl, the same man who died broke and exiled on Madeira 82 years earlier, declaring him Blessed Karl of Austria for his wartime efforts toward peace and his conduct in exile. It was the first time a head of state from the First World War era had ever been beatified by the Catholic Church, and the process toward full sainthood is technically still open today. When his tomb on Madeira was opened in 1972, 50 years after his death, witnesses reported finding his body in a notably preserved state, despite a broken pane of glass that had let in decades of tropical moisture. The church itself has been careful never to call this a miracle, but it's the kind of detail that tends to stick with people who hear the story. A small, strange coda to a life that had already taken more reversals than most families see in 5 generations. So what actually survived? Out of everything the Habsburgs lost in 1918. Not the money, most of that's gone, sold off decades ago to fund 2 failed uprisings in Hungary. Not the palaces, not the crown jewels, not the legal right to use their own titles in Austria or Hungary today. What seems to have survived is something closer to a habit of reinvention. Take whatever's left of the old idea, that the different peoples of Central Europe share something worth building together, and find a completely new form for it in each generation. A parliament instead of a palace, a cultural preservation charity instead of an army, a race car instead of a crown. If a family can lose an empire, a fortune, and a homeland in the space of 1 generation and still end up on the right side of history 70 years later, what does that tell you about what actually keeps a legacy alive? I'd genuinely like to know what you think defined the Habsburgs more. The 6 centuries they spent ruling, or the 100 years they've spent losing gracefully and finding new ground to stand on. Leave your answer in the comments, and if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. It genuinely helps keep this channel going.